I was swiping through this dating app, not really expecting much, when I matched with this guy who seemed pretty interesting. We started chatting, and surprisingly the conversation flowed really well. We had similar interests in books and movies, and he had a great sense of humor that came through even in text. After a couple of weeks of back and forth, we decided to meet up in person. We agreed to meet at a Starbucks in downtown Seattle. I live in Bellevue, so I had to drive across the I-90 bridge to get there. The traffic wasn't too bad that day, which I took as a good sign. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness as I parked my car and walked towards the coffee shop. I spent way too much time that morning deciding what to wear. I finally settled on my favorite jeans, a cute blouse, and a light jacket. You never know with Seattle weather. I also put more effort into my makeup than usual, trying to strike that balance between looking like I made an effort and not seeming too desperate. As I approached the Starbucks, I could see him through the window. He was already there, sitting at a table near the back. He looked just like his profile pictures, which was a relief. You hear so many stories about people looking completely different in real life. He was wearing a blue button-down shirt and looked pretty put together. When I walked in, he stood up and waved me over. He had a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. As I got to the table, he pulled out the chair for me, which I thought was a nice touch. It's not something I expect, but it's always appreciated when someone makes that extra effort. He offered to buy my coffee, insisting it was the least he could do since I had driven into the city. I usually prefer to split the bill on first dates, but I decided to let him get this one. I ordered my usual grande caramel macchiato, and he got a plain black coffee. I remember thinking that his choice seemed very no-nonsense, which kind of fit the vibe I was getting from him. As we sat down with our drinks, I was worried there might be that awkward silence you sometimes get on first dates. But surprisingly, the conversation started flowing pretty naturally. We began by talking about our jobs. He worked in software development for a tech company in the area. Pretty typical for Seattle, to be honest. I told him about my work in marketing, and he seemed genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions about my day-to-day responsibilities and the challenges I face. From there, we moved on to discussing our hobbies. It turned out we were both avid readers, which was one of the things that had initially drawn me to his profile. We spent a good chunk of time comparing notes on our favorite authors and recommending books to each other. He mentioned loving Neil Gaiman, which scored him some major points in my book. We also discovered a shared love of hiking. Living in the Pacific Northwest, it's almost a requirement to enjoy the outdoors, but it was nice to find someone who seemed as enthusiastic about it as I was. We swapped stories about our favorite trails in the area. He told me about a hike he'd done recently up to Rattlesnake Ledge, and I shared my experience of trekking through the Hoh Rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula. As we chatted, I found myself relaxing more and more. He had a way of making me feel comfortable, like I could just be myself. We even shared a few laughs over some dating app horror stories we'd both experienced. It felt good to be able to joke about those experiences with someone who understood. Time was flying by, and before I knew it, we'd been sitting there for over 2 hours. Our coffee cups were long empty, and I was starting to feel a bit hungry. That's when he suggested we grab some lunch. There was a nice Thai place just a few blocks away that he recommended. I was having such a good time that I didn't hesitate to say yes. We walked over to the restaurant, continuing our conversation along the way. The weather was surprisingly nice for Seattle, cloudy but not raining, with even a few patches of blue sky peeking through. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice how easy it felt to be around him. There wasn't any of that first date awkwardness I'd experienced so many times before. The Thai restaurant was cozy and smelled amazing as soon as we walked in. It was decorated with colorful tapestries and had soft traditional music playing in the background. We were seated at a small table near the window, which gave us a nice view of the busy street outside. Looking at the menu, everything sounded delicious. We decided to order a few dishes to share, which I thought was a nice way to approach a meal on a first date. We got pad thai, green curry, and a cashew chicken dish. While we waited for our food, we continued our conversation, this time delving into our travel experiences. He told me about a backpacking trip he'd taken through Europe after college, and I shared stories from my semester abroad in Japan. It was fascinating to hear about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen. I found myself imagining what it would be like to travel with him, which I knew was getting ahead of myself, but I couldn't help it. When the food arrived, it looked and smelled incredible. We dug in, and between bites, we kept talking. The conversation shifted to our families and where we grew up. He was from the East Coast originally, but had moved to Seattle for work about 5 years ago. I told him about growing up in a small town in Oregon and how I'd moved to the Seattle area for college and never left. As we were finishing up our meal, I was feeling really good about how the date was going. Everything seemed to be clicking. We had a lot in common. The conversation was flowing naturally, and I was genuinely enjoying his company. That's when things took an unexpected turn. He put down his fork, looked at me with a big smile, and out of nowhere, he told me he was in love with me. I nearly choked on my cashew chicken. I mean, we'd only just met in person a few hours ago. Sure, we'd been texting for a couple of weeks, but love? That seemed way too intense. Way too soon. I didn't know how to respond. I sat there, probably with a deer in the headlights look on my face, trying to process what he'd just said. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I'd somehow given him the wrong impression, or if he was just the type of person who fell hard and fast. I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel my cheeks burning. I mumbled something about how that was very sweet, but that we'd only just met. He seemed unfazed by my reaction and started talking about how he believed in love at first sight, and how he'd never felt this way about anyone before. The rest of the meal was incredibly awkward. The easy conversation we'd been having earlier was gone, replaced by uncomfortable silences and stilted small talk. I couldn't wait for it to be over. When the check came, I insisted on splitting it, even though he tried to pay for the whole thing. I just wanted to maintain some boundaries at that point. As we left the restaurant, he tried to hold my hand, but I pretended I needed to adjust my jacket. I made up an excuse about needing to get back to work, even though it was Saturday. He looked disappointed, but didn't push it. Walking back to my car, my mind was reeling. How had things gone from so good to so weird so quickly? I kept replaying the date in my head, wondering if I'd missed any red flags earlier. But up until that moment in the restaurant, everything had seemed perfectly normal. When I got to my car, he asked if he could see me again. I gave a non-committal answer about being really busy with work in the coming weeks. He looked crestfallen, but I just couldn't bring myself to be more direct at that moment. I was still processing everything that had happened. The drive home was a blur. I kept thinking about how differently the date had turned out from what I'd expected. It had started so promisingly, and then taken such a strange turn. I felt a mix of disappointment and relief. Disappointed that someone who'd seemed so great turned out to be a bit unhinged, but relieved that I'd found out sooner rather than later. When I got home, I flopped onto my couch and called my best friend to fill her in on what had happened. She was as shocked as I was and agreed that his behavior was definitely not okay. We spent a good hour dissecting every detail of the date, trying to figure out if there were any signs I'd missed. That night, I got a text from him saying how much he'd enjoyed our date and how he couldn't wait to see me again. I didn't respond. The next day, there were more messages, each one more intense than the last, professing his love and talking about our future together. It was clear that he wasn't getting the hint. Finally, I decided I needed to be direct. I sent him a message explaining that while I'd enjoyed parts of our date, I felt his declaration of love was premature and made me uncomfortable. I told him I didn't think we were compatible and wished him the best. He sent back a long, emotional response, but I held my ground and didn't engage further. The whole experience left me feeling a bit shaken. It made me realize how careful you need to be when meeting people online. Someone can seem perfectly normal in messages or even in person for a while, but you never really know what's going on in their head. It all started when I decided to try my luck with a dating app. You know, one of those popular ones where you swipe right if you like someone's profile. I'd been single for a while and figured it couldn't hurt to put myself out there. After a few days of swiping and some forgettable conversations, I matched with a guy named Brad. His profile looked promising, nice smile, good job, and we seemed to have a few things in common. We started chatting, and I was pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. We messaged back and forth for a few weeks, covering all sorts of topics from our favorite movies to our dream vacations. Brad told me he was relatively new to Miami, having moved there for work about 6 months ago. As a Miami native, I was excited at the prospect of showing him around my city. We talked about our favorite spots in town, and I suggested a few places he might like to check out. After a couple of weeks of great conversations, we decided it was time to meet up in person. We agreed on a casual date at a beautiful park by the marina. I suggested Bayfront Park, which is one of my favorite spots in the city. It's right on Biscayne Bay, with a great view of the water and the port of Miami. Plus, it's always bustling with people, which I thought would be perfect for a first date. Public enough to feel safe, but with plenty to see and do. The day of our date arrived, and I was a mix of excited and nervous. I spent way too long deciding what to wear, finally settling on a cute sundress and comfortable sandals. It was a beautiful sunny day, typical Miami weather, warm with a gentle breeze coming off the water. I arrived at the park a few minutes early and found a spot near the pepper fountain to wait for Brad. As I stood there taking in the scenery, I couldn't help but feel optimistic about the date. The park was lively, with families having picnics on the grass, joggers on the paths, and tourists taking photos of the bay. I spotted Brad walking towards me, and I have to admit, my heart did a little flip. He looked just like his profile pictures, tall, with short, dark hair and a friendly smile. He was dressed casually in khaki shorts and a blue polo shirt, which I thought suited him well. As he approached, he gave me a warm smile and a wave. We greeted each other with a slightly awkward hug. You know, that weird dance you do when you're meeting someone for the first time and you're not sure if you should shake hands or hug. But once that was out of the way, things started to feel more comfortable. We decided to take a walk around the park, starting along the bay walk. The view was beautiful, with the sunlight sparkling on the water and boats sailing by in the distance. As we walked, we fell into easy conversation. Brad asked me about growing up in Miami, and I shared some stories about my childhood adventures in the city. He told me more about his move to Miami, explaining that he'd relocated from Chicago for a job in finance. We talked about the culture shock of moving from the Midwest to South Florida, and I gave him some tips on dealing with the humidity and the occasional hurricane warning. As we strolled through the park, we passed by the amphitheater. There was a small event going on, some local bands playing music. We stopped to listen for a bit, swaying to the rhythm of a catchy salsa tune. Brad mentioned that he'd always wanted to learn how to dance salsa, and I promised to recommend some good dance schools in the area. We continued our walk, making our way towards the center of the park. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on our jobs, hobbies, and favorite spots in the city. I found myself relaxing more and more as we talked. Brad seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own experiences. As we reached the pepper fountain, we decided to sit on a nearby bench to rest for a bit. The sound of the water was soothing, and there was a nice breeze that offered some relief from the Miami heat. We sat there, people watching and chatting about our families and upbringings. Everything seemed to be going well. Brad was charming, attentive, and easy to talk to. I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd gotten lucky with this dating app match. After sitting for a while, we decided to continue our walk. We headed towards the north end of the park, where there's a nice view of the cruise ships docked at the port of Miami. As we walked, Brad asked if I'd mind if we took a photo together. He explained that he liked to document his experiences in the city, especially the new places he visited. I thought it was a cute idea, so I agreed. We were looking for a good spot to take a selfie when a passerby offered to take a photo for us. It was an older man with a friendly smile, probably a tourist enjoying the park. We thanked him and posed for the picture, standing close together with the bay in the background. As the man was about to take the photo, he commented on what a nice couple we made. I felt a little embarrassed. After all, this was our first date, but I just smiled politely. Brad, however, seemed to tense up a bit at the comment. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming he was just feeling a little awkward about the situation. The man took a couple of photos and handed the phone back to Brad. We thanked him, and he went on his way. Brad showed me the photos, and I had to admit they came out pretty nice. The lighting was good, and we both had genuine smiles on our faces. We continued our walk, heading back towards the center of the park. The sun was starting to set, casting a beautiful orange glow over the bay. I was just thinking about how perfect the evening had been when everything suddenly went wrong. We were walking past a small grove of trees when, without any warning, Brad suddenly put his hands around my neck and started to choke me. It happened so fast that at first I couldn't even process what was happening. One moment we were having a pleasant conversation, and the next, I couldn't breathe. In that moment, time seemed to both stand still and speed up. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This person who had seemed so kind and normal was now attacking me in broad daylight in a public park. I felt a rush of fear and adrenaline unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Instinctively, I started to struggle. I clawed at his hands, trying to pry them away from my throat. I kicked out, aiming for his shins, his knees, anything I could reach. The world around me started to blur, black spots dancing at the edges of my vision. Just when I thought I was going to pass out, I managed to knee him hard in the stomach. His grip loosened just enough for me to wrench myself free. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my throat burning. Brad looked shocked, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. For a split second, we just stared at each other. Then, survival instinct kicking in, I turned and ran as fast as I could towards a group of people I could see near the fountain. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. My legs felt like jelly, but fear propelled me forward. As I ran, I started shouting for help. My voice was hoarse and barely above a whisper at first, but I kept trying. I reached the group of people, a family setting up for a picnic, and collapsed to my knees, still struggling to catch my breath. Between gasps, I managed to explain what had happened. The father of the family immediately stepped in front of me, shielding me from the direction I'd come from, while the mother pulled out her phone to call the police. Looking back, I saw Brad standing where I'd left him, looking unsure of what to do. When he saw the family helping me and heard the mother calling the police, he turned and ran towards the park exit. The next few hours were a blur. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them my statement. They took photos of the bruises that were already forming on my neck and asked me for a description of Brad. I was still in shock, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock my phone to show them his profile on the dating app. The officers were kind and understanding. They assured me they would do everything they could to find Brad. They also arranged for a victim advocate to come and speak with me, which I appreciated. The advocate provided me with resources for counseling and support groups, as well as information about how to obtain a restraining order if necessary. After what felt like hours of talking to the police and the victim advocate, I was finally able to go home. A female officer offered to drive me, which I gratefully accepted. I didn't feel safe taking public transportation or a ride share after what had happened. When I got home, the reality of the situation really hit me. I broke down crying as soon as I walked through my door. My roommate, hearing me come in, came out of her room and was shocked to see the state I was in. Through tears, I explained what had happened. She was horrified and immediately sprang into action, making me tea and wrapping me in a blanket while I sat on the couch, still shaking. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brad's face, felt his hands on my throat. My roommate stayed up with me, talking to me and making sure I wasn't alone with my thoughts. About a week after the incident, I got a call from the police. They had managed to track Brad down using the information from his dating app profile. It turned out that Brad wasn't even his real name, and he had a history of similar attacks in other cities. I felt a mix of relief that he had been caught and anger that he had been able to hurt other women before me. The legal process that followed was long and often frustrating. I had to recount my story multiple times, each retelling bringing back the fear and panic of that day. But I was determined to see it through, not just for myself, but for any other women he might have hurt if he hadn't been stopped. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to prison. The verdict brought a sense of closure, but it didn't erase what had happened. I still had nightmares sometimes, still felt anxious in certain situations, but I was healing, slowly but surely. I took a long break from dating after that, focusing on myself and my healing. When I did eventually feel ready to try again, I approached it differently. I was more careful, insisted on video chats before meeting in person, and always made sure someone knew where I was going and who I was meeting. I'd been on the app for a while, but hadn't really found anyone who caught my interest. That is, until I came across this girl's profile that stood out from the rest. Her bio mentioned she was really into the rockabilly scene, which immediately piqued my curiosity. For those who don't know, rockabilly is this cool fusion of rock and roll and hillbilly music that originated in the 1950s. It's got this whole aesthetic that goes with it. Think pin-up girls, hot rods, and pompadours. I'd always been fascinated by the style, but never really dove into the scene myself. Anyway, I swiped right on her profile, and to my surprise, we matched almost instantly. We started chatting, and I was immediately drawn in by her passion for the rockabilly lifestyle. She told me about the music, the fashion, and the whole culture surrounding it. It was refreshing to talk to someone who was so enthusiastic about their interests. We messaged back and forth for a few days, getting to know each other better. Her name was Roxy, which I thought was perfect for a rockabilly girl, and she'd been part of the scene for years. She shared stories about the best rockabilly nights in New York City, and I found myself wanting to experience it firsthand. After about a week of chatting, Roxy mentioned that there was a rockabilly-themed night coming up at a nightclub in the East Village. She asked if I'd like to join her, and I jumped at the chance. I was excited not just to meet her, but also to get a taste of this subculture I'd only admired from afar. The night of our date arrived, and I spent way too long trying to figure out what to wear. I wanted to fit in with the rockabilly crowd, but I also didn't want to look like I was trying too hard. I settled on a pair of dark jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and my leather jacket. I even attempted to style my hair into a bit of a quiff, though I'm not sure how successful I was. I took the subway from my place in Brooklyn to the East Village, my stomach doing flips the whole way. When I got off at the 2nd Avenue station, I could already see people dressed in 1950 S-style outfits heading in the direction of the club. I followed the crowd, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The club was called Swing 46, and even from the outside, I could tell it was going to be an experience. There was a line stretching down the block, full of people dressed to the nines in vintage-inspired outfits. The sound of rockabilly music was spilling out onto the street every time the door opened. I texted Roxy to let her know I had arrived, and she told me she was already inside. The bouncer checked my ID, and I stepped into a world that felt like a time warp. The interior of the club was decked out to look like a 1950s diner, complete with checkered floors and red vinyl booths. A live band was on stage belting out a fast-paced rockabilly tune that had the dance floor packed. I scanned the crowd looking for Roxy. It took me a moment to spot her, but when I did, my jaw nearly hit the floor. She looked amazing in a vintage-style dress with a sweetheart neckline and a full skirt that flared out when she moved. Her hair was styled in perfect victory rolls, and she had bright red lipstick that matched her dress. When she saw me, her face lit up with a smile. She waved me over, and I made my way through the crowd to her. Up close, she was even more stunning. We greeted each other with a hug, and I immediately felt a bit underdressed compared to her perfectly put-together look. Roxy didn't seem to mind my casual outfit, though. She told me she was glad I came and asked if I wanted to get a drink. We made our way to the bar, squeezing past couples doing some impressive swing dancing. I ordered a beer while Roxy got something called a pink lady that came in a fancy cocktail glass. As we sipped our drinks, Roxy filled me in on the band that was playing. Apparently, they were pretty well known in the rockabilly scene, and she'd seen them perform several times before. I was impressed by her knowledge of the music and the artists. It was clear this wasn't just a passing interest for her, but a real passion. After we finished our drinks, Roxy asked if I wanted to dance. I warned her that I had 2 left feet, but she just laughed and said she'd teach me. She took my hand and led me onto the dance floor. The band was playing a slower song now, which Roxy told me was perfect for beginners. She showed me the basic steps of what she called East Coast swing. It was a bit awkward at first. I kept stepping on her toes and losing the rhythm. But Roxy was patient, guiding me through the steps and encouraging me when I got it right. After a few songs, I was starting to get the hang of it, and I found myself really enjoying it. As we danced, Roxy told me more about how she got into the rockabilly scene. She'd always been fascinated by vintage fashion and old movies, and when she discovered rockabilly music in college, everything just clicked for her. She loved the energy of the music, the style of the fashion, and the sense of community in the scene. We took a break from dancing after a while, both of us a bit out of breath and in need of refreshment. We found an empty booth and slid in, ordering another round of drinks. The conversation flowed easily between us. I told her about my job as a graphic designer, and she shared stories about the rockabilly festivals she'd been to around the country. As we were chatting, I couldn't help but feel like this was going really well. Roxy was funny, passionate, and easy to talk to. Plus, she was introducing me to this whole new world that I found fascinating. I was already thinking about asking her out on a second date. The night was in full swing, the dance floor packed with people showing off their moves. Roxy and I were just finishing our drinks when a commotion near the bar caught our attention. A guy had accidentally bumped into someone, spilling his drink all over them. From where we were sitting, I could see that the person who got splashed was wearing a beautiful vintage dress that now had a large, dark stain down the front. I winced, knowing how upset I'd be if that happened to me. The guy who spilled his drink was apologizing profusely, offering to pay for dry cleaning or buy a new dress. The woman whose dress was ruined looked upset but was trying to be gracious about it. Roxy, who had been watching the scene unfold, suddenly stood up. She had a look on her face that I couldn't quite read, a mix of anger and determination. Before I could say anything, she was striding across the club towards the commotion. I got up to follow her, not sure what she was planning to do, but feeling like I should be there to support her if needed. As I made my way through the crowd, I saw Roxy reach the scene of the accident. She said something to the woman in the stained dress, who nodded in response. Then, without warning, Roxy turned to the guy who had spilled his drink. In a flash, her fist connected with his face, catching him completely off guard. The guy stumbled backward, knocking into a table and sending glasses crashing to the floor. The club, which had been full of music and laughter just moments before, suddenly went quiet. Everyone was staring at the scene unfolding before them. I stood there frozen in shock, trying to process what had just happened. Roxy, breathing heavily and shaking out her hand, turned on her heel and started making her way towards the exit. As she passed me, she grabbed her purse from our booth and kept walking. It took me a moment to snap out of my stunned state and follow her. By the time I made it outside, Roxy was already halfway down the block. I jogged to catch up with her, my mind racing with questions. When I reached her, I gently touched her arm to get her attention. She whirled around, her face a mix of anger and something else. Embarrassment, maybe? I asked her what happened back there, trying to keep my tone neutral. Roxy took a deep breath and explained that she knew the woman whose dress got ruined. Apparently, they were part of the same rockabilly social circle, and the dress was a rare vintage piece that the woman had saved up for months to buy. Roxy said she just saw red when she realized how devastated her friend must be. She admitted that punching the guy was an overreaction, but she said she couldn't stand seeing someone so careless ruin something so precious to her friend. As we stood there on the sidewalk, the adrenaline seemed to wear off, and Roxy's shoulders slumped. She apologized for ruining our date and said she'd understand if I didn't want to see her again. She looked so different from the confident, excited woman I'd met earlier in the evening. I was conflicted. On one hand, I was shocked by the sudden violence and how quickly things had escalated. It was definitely not how I expected the night to end. On the other hand, I could see that Roxy was genuinely upset and remorseful about her actions. After a moment of hesitation, I suggested we walk for a bit to cool off. Roxy agreed, and we started making our way through the East Village streets. As we walked, Roxy opened up more about her past. She told me about growing up in a rough neighborhood where she had to learn to stand up for herself and her friends. She said she'd worked hard to leave that part of her life behind, but sometimes her old instincts took over. I listened as she talked, trying to reconcile the different sides of her I'd seen tonight. the passionate, fun-loving rockabilly enthusiast and the fiery, protective friend. It was a lot to process, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it all. We ended up at a 24-hour diner, sliding into a booth and ordering coffee. The familiar setting seemed to help Roxy relax a bit. She asked me what I thought about everything that had happened, her eyes searching my face for a reaction. I took a moment to gather my thoughts before responding. I told her that while I understood her desire to stand up for her friend, I couldn't condone violence as a solution. I explained that the sudden outburst had scared me a little, and made me wonder if there was more to her personality that I hadn't seen yet. Roxy nodded, accepting my words without argument. She admitted that she had a temper and that it was something she was working on. She told me about the anger management classes she'd taken in the past, and how she'd been doing better until tonight's incident. As we sat there in the diner, sipping our coffee and talking, I found myself in a strange position. Part of me was still excited about Roxy and the world she'd introduced me to. The rockabilly scene, the music, the dancing, it had all been so much fun. But another part of me was wary, unsure if I could handle the intensity that came with her. We ended up talking for hours in that diner long after our coffee had gone cold. Roxy shared more about her life, her struggles, and her dreams. I opened up too, telling her about my own past and the things I was working on in myself. It was a raw, honest conversation that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. As the sky outside began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we finally decided to call it a night. We walked to the subway station together, both of us exhausted but feeling like we'd reached a new understanding. Before we parted ways, Roxy asked if she'd ever see me again. I hesitated, genuinely unsure of what to say. After a moment, I told her that I needed some time to process everything that had happened. I said I'd like to stay in touch, but that I wasn't ready to commit to another date just yet. Roxy seemed to understand. She thanked me for listening and for not immediately writing her off. We exchanged a somewhat awkward hug before heading to our separate platforms. On the subway ride back to Brooklyn, I found myself replaying the events of the night in my head. The excitement of the Rockabilly Club, the fun of learning to dance, the shock of the punch, and the long, intense conversation that followed. It was certainly not the date I had expected when I first swiped right on Roxy's profile. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Roxy and our date often. I was torn between my attraction to her passion and energy, and my concerns about her temper. I knew that one incident didn't define a person, but it had definitely given me pause. After about a week, Roxy reached out to me. She sent a message apologizing again for what happened, and asking if I'd be willing to give her another chance. She said she'd started seeing a therapist again to work on her anger issues, and that she really enjoyed the time we spent together before things went south. I took a few days to think it over before responding. In the end, I decided that while I wasn't ready for another date, I was open to staying in touch as friends. I told Roxy that I admired her willingness to work on herself, and that I'd be interested in hearing how things were going for her. To my surprise, Roxy took this well. She thanked me for my honesty and said she'd like to be friends too. Over the next few months, we kept in touch, mostly through text messages and the occasional phone call. She kept me updated on her progress with therapy and anger management, and I shared bits about my life too. While Roxy and I never did go on another date, I'm glad I took the chance on swiping right on her profile. That one night opened my eyes to a whole new world and taught me valuable lessons about myself and others. It's a reminder that sometimes the most memorable experiences come from taking risks and stepping out of our comfort zones, even if they don't always turn out the way we expect. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.